Clara returned to the bakery it was a cold, foggy morning in the small village of Willowbrook. The meadows surrounding the village were usually peaceful, but today they were the scene of a gruesome discovery. The body of Mr. Henry Blackwood, a wealthy landowner, was found lying near the old oak tree in the middle of the meadow. His lifeless body was sprawled on the grass, and a single gunshot wound to his chest told the story of his untimely death. The villagers were in shock. Mr. Blackwood was a respected man, though not particularly liked. He had a reputation for being strict and demanding, especially with his tenants. But who would want him dead? The local police were baffled. They had no leads, no suspects, and no motive. That's when they decided to call in Detective Arthur Collins, a retired investigator known for his sharp mind and keen eye for detail. Detective Collins arrived in Willowbrook that evening, his trench coat flapping in the wind as he stepped off the train. The detective wasted no time. He went straight to the meadow to examine the crime scene. The ground was muddy from the previous night's rain, and footprints were clearly visible near the body. Collins knelt down, studying the footprints carefully. There were two sets of prints, one belonging to the victim and another, smaller set, likely from the killer. Next, he examined the body. The gunshot wound was precise, indicating the killer knew how to handle a firearm. There were no signs of a struggle, which suggested that Mr. Blackwood had known his attacker. Collins also noticed a small piece of paper clutched in the victim's hand. It was a torn corner of a letter, with the words, "Meet me at the oak tree at midnight." Barely legible. Detective Collins decided to visit Blackwood's estate to gather more information. The mansion was grand, but had an air of neglect. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grayson, greeted him at the door. She was a frail woman in her 60s, with a nervous demeanor. Mr. Blackwood was a difficult man, she confessed when Collins questioned her. He had many enemies, but I can't imagine anyone wanting to kill him. Did he have any visitors last night? Collins asked. Mrs. Grayson hesitated. Yes, sir. Mr. James Whittaker came by in the evening. He's one of Mr. Blackwood's tenants. They argued about the rent, but Mr. Whittaker left before dinner. Collins made a mental note to speak with James Whittaker. He also learned that Blackwood had a strained relationship with his nephew, Edward Blackwood, who stood to inherit his uncle's fortune. The next day, Collins visited James Whittaker. Whittaker was a burly man with a rough exterior, but he seemed genuinely shocked by Blackwood's death. I did argue with him, Whittaker admitted. He raised the rent again, and I couldn't afford it. But I didn't kill him. I was home all night. Collins wasn't convinced. He decided to dig deeper. He returned to the meadow and followed the smaller set of footprints. They led him to a nearby shed, where he found a hidden compartment containing a revolver. The gun had been recently fired. The detective then turned his attention to Edward Blackwood. Edward was a young man in his 20s, with a reputation for gambling and drinking. When Collins confronted him, Edward denied any involvement in his uncle's death. Search for more clues. She noticed a small piece of fabric caught on the edge of the counter. It was a dark blue thread, the same color as the coat Joe had described. She also found a muddy footprint near the back door, which matched the dirt on Tom's shoes. Putting the pieces together, Clara realized that Tom had been lying. She confronted him, and after some pressure, he broke down and confessed. Tom had been struggling with money and had teamed up with the stranger Joe had seen. They had planned the robbery together, but Tom hadn't meant for Mr. Grimes to get hurt. With Tom's confession, Clara was able to track down the stranger, who was hiding in a nearby town. The case was solved, and the villagers of Maplewood could breathe a sigh of relief. Mr. Grimes recovered and returned to his bakery, where the smell of fresh bread once again filled the air. As for Clara, she left Maplewood with a sense of satisfaction. The local mystery had been solved, and peace had returned to the little village. But she knew that even in the quietest of places, secrets could lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. I may not have liked him, "But I didn't kill him," Edward said. "Besides, I was at the inn last night. Plenty of people saw me." Collins checked Edward's alibi, and it held up. He was indeed at the inn, playing cards until the early hours of the morning. Frustrated, Collins returned to the crime scene. He re-examined the torn piece of paper and noticed something he had missed before: a faint perfume scent. It was a floral fragrance, one he recognized from his visit to Blackwood's estate. He rushed back to the mansion and confronted Mrs. Grayson. "You were at the Meadow that night, weren't you?" Collins asked. Mrs. Grayson's face turned pale. I didn't mean to hurt him. He was going to fire me after all these years. I just wanted to talk to him, but he became angry. He grabbed me, and I panicked. I had the revolver with me for protection. It went off accidentally." Detective Collins sighed. It was a tragic case of self-defense gone wrong. Mrs. Grayson was arrested, and the mystery of the murder in the Meadow was finally solved. As Collins left Willowbrook, he couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. The peaceful village would never be the same again.